Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I am your host, Steven Pynakker, and I'm very excited to have a well-renowned scholar, Colby Townsend, onto my program. Colby, it's a real pleasure to have you on. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Steven. It's really good to be here. I've enjoyed watching your show.
Okay, well, that's great. And so I got to read your bio here, dude, but it's now not coming up. So why don't you give us a little bit of your scholastic background and tell the audience about it?
Yeah, definitely. I have 2 undergrad degrees, one in comparative literature and one in religious studies, both from the University of Utah. And then I have a master's degree in history from Utah State University. And currently, I'm working in an MA PhD program in English at Indiana University Bloomington.
So you have quite an extensive time in academia, and of course you're a very busy guy, dude. And you're like, part of the reason we're doing this interview now is I have no idea if we're going to have the opportunity to do another interview through the fall semester. So I thought I got to get you on as soon as possible. So I'm glad we were able to work our schedules out. So Colby, here you are. You're the middle child. You like to skateboard. You like to play the guitar in your bedroom at night. And yet you're also interested in ancient scripture or documents. Tell me what kindled that interest.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, just growing up in bountiful Utah, growing up in a very, conservative and religious state, I wanted to understand, this text, the Bible, and understand it a lot better. Understand its origins, its background, and how the individual texts were composed, and all of those kinds of things. So yeah, that was what I originally went to do during my undergrad, was just to study actually Hebrew Bible. I took courses on New Testament and Mormon studies in the religious studies department. Well, it was not the department, but in the religious studies program at the University of Utah as an undergrad. But yeah, really my whole plan originally was just to do Hebrew Bible and early Judaism. So a lot of things with Dead Sea Scrolls and, the kind of the historical context. But yeah, so that was sort of the trajectory. And through the sort of graduate process, I shifted at Utah State University more toward like early American literature, the long 18th century, reception history of the Bible, the development of biblical criticism, those kinds of things. So still very related to what I was doing as an undergrad and wanting to do in graduate school. But yeah, just a slight shift. I do a little bit more with literature now, and more broadly how the Bible, the King James Bible in particular, has influenced modern society.
Yes, and we're going to get to that. And I want to talk right now a little bit about modern biblical scholarship, a little bit of higher criticism and lower criticism. Just kind of explain to me the lay of the land right now where it comes to textual criticism and biblical scholarship in the modern context.
Yeah, so there a lot of people can be surprised at some of the very basic conclusions of modern biblical criticism. I did an interview a year ago with your friend Rick Bennett over at Gospel Tangents, and we talked quite a bit about that. And a lot of the things that I shared were just pretty basic conclusions in biblical criticism. And it was really interesting to see some of the responses to that in the months afterward. But yeah, it's still a developing process. I engage more specifically with Hebrew Bible still than New Testament textual criticism. But if you were to go in and sit down at any of the sessions at this year's annual meeting for the Society of Biblical Literature, they're going to be in San Antonio this year. You would see very, very well developed tools that are used on a daily basis by thousands and thousands of scholars. Most of them, this is something that a lot of people don't seem to know, most of them actually have a faith that they're connected to, that they're tied to. Some of them, grew up a certain tradition and left that one for another one. Some of them left that for nothing. So, but it's very apparent though that for most of the scholars that I engage with in the Society of Biblical Literature and other societies as well, that it's still very important to their faith in one way or another, right? But that in order to understand the text of the Bible and its literary and historical contexts, multiple, plural contexts, then there are, lots and lots of tools that scholars can use to understand those texts. Not only just scholars, but lay readers as well, who want to understand the text and the history of the Bible better. So there are always ongoing discussions about, just as an example, the composition of the Pentateuch, the Torah, so the 5 books of Moses and how those were composed. And it's kind of popular right now for over the last decade or so to say that there's this sort of eruption of chaos going on in biblical scholarship because the documentary hypothesis sort of got knocked down a few rungs a few decades ago. But even then, all American and Israeli and European scholars agree still on something like 60% of identifying which sources the 5 books come from. So just as like a crash course, I guess, the documentary hypothesis was the theory that pretty much everybody agreed on for about 100 years, from Julius Wellhausen in the 1870s until almost the same year, 100 years later, in the late 1970s, with Rolf Rentorf. That was the reigning theory, and it was essentially that when you jump into the beginning of Genesis, you have 2 creation accounts, and you have all of these differences and repetitions and contradictions. That's really a big key, the contradictions. And scholars in the 18th century, some biblical scholars, some not. Jean Astruc was actually a physician. He was a French physician. He was the one that he was actually defending Mosaic authorship when he created what would become the documentary hypothesis. So he was actually really trying to stick to the faith and stick to the traditions. But what he created would later become the documentary hypothesis. And it essentially argues that there are 4 sources that went into the composition of the Torah, the Pentateuch. And it's J, E, D, and P. And J is the Yahwistic source, E is the Elohist, D, Deuteronomy, and P is the priestly source. So the Genesis 1 starts with the priestly source. It's focused on the calendar, it's on the 6 days of creation and resting on the 7th, those kinds of things. And Genesis 2, but 4 verses in, starts the J sources account of creation. So you actually have the statement, when there was nothing on the earth, when there was no man, but so readers over the last few hundred years at least have looked at that and said, but there are people, just that one chapter before. That was the reigning theory, like J, E, D, and P. It was very clear cut. And then in the 1970s, some German scholars looked back at that and said, basically, priestly source, yes, Deuteronomy, yes, but all of these other sources, especially E and J, they're too disparate. It's not really like a clear running narrative. And so these really aren't continuous sources. There is nothing that sort of binds the source together like it does with P and D. And so for Europeans, it's P and D, and then non-P and non-D. There's even some pre-P. So it's a little bit more complicated there, but still Europeans, American and Israeli scholars, and Japanese and Indian and lots of other scholars all around the world, all still have a very good sense of those 5 books coming together through disparate sources and being edited together as one whole. And you essentially have something like that for most of the rest of the Hebrew Bible. There are some books like Malachi that don't have very many sort of accretions or additions. Zechariah splits right in half. Zechariah 1 through 8 was probably written mostly by Zechariah. Zechariah 9 through 14 is by Deutero-Zechariah. Isaiah is a really famous one. Lots of people know, that they're the tripartite separation of Isaiah. So the three authors. There are actually far more than that within Isaiah itself. It's complicated. But yeah, you get that even in the New Testament too. 2 Corinthians, New Testament scholars argue that that might be as many as 2 to 5 different epistles that were all kind of spliced together. So yeah, historians and biblical scholars look at these texts, try to understand their origins, their contexts, and at the same time, it's not just about that. There are other scholars as well trying to understand their influence, trying to understand how over the centuries for different communities, those texts have been read and understood, and other authors have built on them as well.
So we're going to get back to Isaiah in a little while in regards to the Book of Mormon. I just want to have a little conversation with you because I actually have a couple questions that I want to ask a biblical scholar. So I have one in front of me, so I'll just ask them. One of the dominant theories in the creation of the New Testament is, especially regarding the Gospels, is that you have this hypothetical document called Q, which is German for, or Quelle for source. And basically it's thought that the authors of Matthew and Mark were using, Matthew and Luke, were using Mark and Q. Is that generally speaking the consensus within biblical scholarship?
From what I've seen with a handful of my friends that are directly in New Testament scholarship, that is still the dominant theory. I think over the last few years, maybe 5 years or so, I've seen some of them mention that there have been some cracks starting to develop. There are a handful of scholars that have published books recently that attempt to argue that Luke actually knew Matthew, and that Luke was building on Matthew and Mark. And then, of course, to add to what you were saying as well, Matthew and Luke both used Mark, but then they also had Q. This would be the theory that you're talking about. But then they also had material that was unique to them, that you only find in Matthew, that you only find in Luke. But yeah, the shift that I've been seeing, I don't know how drastic it will be, but it's potentially moving in that direction. Will be at least that more scholars will start to argue that Luke was dependent on Matthew. So we'll see. Kloppenberg is kind of the main scholar for Q. You can read any of his books; they're all fantastic. And he'll probably be continue to be sort of the main proponent of that. But he's also really good from what I've seen, and I haven't seen a whole lot from him, but in at least saying, okay, there are some issues here, but still, this is still the best theory.
So yeah, I mean, I've engaged a little bit with Dr. Mark Goodacre, who's kind of become a proponent of this, and actually our mutual friend, Dr. Christopher Thomas, actually advocates this position as well. And so I just find it very interesting because I'm kind of like doing an Occam's. I'm actually just going to ask these questions because I have you here. So, but I have like an Occam's razor situation here, where the simplest explanation being, to me, it almost makes more sense that Luke had access to Matthew and Mark, and it actually is the simplest explanation, and so therefore, in one sense, could be the correct one. Now, I still lean towards the Q hypothesis, but I do think that this new scholarship that's coming out is very intriguing to me, and I kind of like look at it in one sense, and this is kind of just me being a little naughty, is that it's almost as though you have a secular Gnosticism. We have this mysterious document that we can access with this special knowledge that it contains, and it's called Q, the source. And I thought it just kind of comes across that way to me a little bit. I'm being a little cheeky, but I just want to get your response to that.
No, I think that's a good point. And yeah, I think that Q is complicated. I mean, you can get critical editions of Q. There's a version of it published in the Hermeneia commentary series, and the same editors did another version of it, I think in Peters or another European publisher. But it's really, really complicated, and that's an area that I haven't really delved into a ton. Because it's not directly related to my research. But yeah, there are some things that for work that I have done, I would have questions for Goodacre and a few others, because I think it is interesting how, it's very clear that Matthew cobbles together bits and pieces of something, and you get the Sermon on the Mount. And it's complicated to me to then see that and how it would become the Sermon on the Plain if Luke was dependent on Matthew. But I'm sure that there could be some good explanation from Mark Goodacre or one of his colleagues that could explain that to me. But yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you for being a good sport and indulging me on this little conversation. So one of the things I want to talk about is we're going to kind of engage one of the areas that you have recently been getting really interested in, which is the literature. And you were telling me, we were having a conversation the other day, and you were telling me about what historians of this period call the long 18th century, which covers the periods of 1660 to 1830. In other words, that's kind of like viewed as, and actually you said you've done a little bit stuff before that as well, but essentially that's kind of like an era of history that historians look at and study and specialize in. Kind of explain what that's all about.
Yeah, it's kind of just an attempt to not be too rigid on the centuries that we study, right? So I study what's called the long 18th century, but I'm also involved in the C19. It's a society of scholars who study the 19th century as well. So it allows historians to recognize that while we have the chronology and the years and we divide everything up, things didn't change from as drastically as we would think from 1690 to 1710, right? You don't just ignore 1690 if you're studying 1710. And so it's basically that attempt to say, yeah, like most of this stuff that I study and look at falls within this century, but I kind of need to go 40 years this way, 30 years this way, and it's all kind of included. I think that it originated with some British scholarship, trying to understand the period and particularly British literature. But yeah, there are scholars of the long 19th century, which goes back a little into the 18th and a little into the 20th. So yeah, the periodizing has been, and I think rightly so, sort of muffled a little bit at the edges, and trying to incorporate more into that century so that we can really understand. Just like today, we can't really understand a lot of international politics without also studying the 80s and 90s, the 1980s and 90s. So yeah, it's just recognizing that things didn't just sort of start in 2000.
So
however you do that.
So I would say, like, okay, so this period of time, of course, 1660 to 1830. 1830 is like, it's an important date within Mormonism. It encompasses this period of time. And one of the things that you've kind of been delving into is the Bible's influence on literature, in particular the King James Version, on the literature of this period of time. So maybe just delve into that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, that really started for me during my master's degree. I was working with Phil Barlow at Utah State University, and some other just incredible scholars that were on my committee there. Yeah, I wanted to really dive in a little bit more to the writings of, like, Milton is really kind of at the beginning of that period, the 1660s. So I do technically go a little bit earlier than that because Milton was writing before the 1660s. And in my master's thesis, I wrote quite a bit on the humanists and the development of biblical scholarship in the 16th century. But yeah, the majority of the texts and the people that I study are some, fall somewhere within the 1660s with Milton, also John Bunyan, Pilgrim's Progress, and his other works, all the way up until 1830. And those are pretty widely recognized. Like if you're talking about the long 18th century, it's just funny that 1830 is right at the beginning of Mormonism. And yeah, really with my study, with Mormonism, I know certain, some things after the 1830s, but really I have stayed with up until about 1833 with my research on early Mormonism. I study, specifically the texts, how they were composed, what kinds of sources went into them and influences, those kinds of things. And yeah, I'm finding a lot of other things right now in the 18th century that I'm really enjoying studying, Gothic literature in particular. So that is widely recognized as starting in the 1760s, and particularly 1764 and 65, with the first and second editions of Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto. So those are really fun. It goes, the classics, the origins of Gothic literature go from about 1764 to the 1820s. But I also study in the early 19th century, the historical romances of Walter Scott. I do quite a bit of work also with the influence of the Bible and print culture and material culture, as far as studying what kinds of biblical commentaries were available, who was sort of cobbling together biblical commentaries, because there were actually a lot of books that were printed that way, where you might have some of Poole's notes and Henry's notes and other scholars from the the 18th century, all kind of combined into one by some random editor. So yeah, I jump around quite a bit and look at that. I also do quite a bit of on the influence of the French Revolution in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So that was a key part of the argument of my thesis, in my master's thesis. So yeah, there are a lot of different things that I work with, and I'm sort of on this trajectory of trying to figure out, okay, studying Gothic literature and religious literature and all these different texts and like the political influences, which are very similar. And yeah, just kind of trying to figure out how to put the tools that I've developed over the years that I've been in undergrad and graduate school toward that kind of study, and the kinds of I guess fruits of that labor can be found in the 4 or so essays that I've published up to this point. So
yeah, I've had a chance to peruse some of those as well. So yeah, I kind of want to talk a little bit about how, in the context of King James influence on literature, I just want you to briefly talk a little bit about, I remember a few years ago, there was a big thing about the late war and how it was written in a King James style, and how some people have kind of maybe paralleled or compared that to the style of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, I think it was the Johnson brothers at ex-Mormon conference released some of the data that they had been working on. I think that they had actually written some kind of software that looked at it compared sort of the biblical cadence, I guess, the King James cadence of the Book of Mormon to other texts. And yeah, the late war was published, I think, just after the War of 1812. I don't remember exactly what year it was published. But yeah, that was the one on their sheet that came up the most related to the Book of Mormon. So yeah, I think that there is still work that could be done in that area. A friend of mine, Ryan Thomas, did a handful of blog posts at the time, several years ago, looking at some of those connections. It's been a little while since I've looked at that. But for me, yeah, like for all of the ways that I've sort of analyzed the text of the Book of Mormon, the King James Bible is the clearest as far as direct influence is concerned, on not just language, but the actual structure, the actual writing of the narratives and the stories within the Book of Mormon itself. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in that area that hasn't been done yet. Some publications over the last 3 or 4 decades have sort of pointed in some of those directions. Like, it's been really popular to note that, the exodus from Jerusalem by Lehi and his family is, there are some connections there with the actual exodus in the Torah. So there are things like that, but then there are also, more direct connections, like with, and this one has been noted in some traditional publications as well within Mormonism, the capturing of some of the Lamanite daughters by the priests of Noah is dependent on one of the narratives toward the end of the book of Judges. Just those kinds of things. But then there are also lots of stories that are dependent on the New Testament as well. And those ones can actually span large swaths of the story and the narrative of the Book of Mormon. So those haven't really been fully explored yet either. A lot more needs to be done on the influence of the New Testament on the Book of Mormon. One of my good friends down at BYU, Nick Frederick, has been really sort of trailblazing that area of study and getting more and more scholars to take that more seriously and to really think through the influence of the New Testament on the Book of Mormon. So he usually has at least a couple of publications every year on the influence of the New Testament on the Book of Mormon.
So, this whole process of doing this software, these programs where you're trying to find, is that something that you would integrate into your research if you were doing studies? And also, like, even just getting back to like the different theories about the priestly sources and and all that kind of stuff, is it possible that they could also use that same software to try to identify those separate sources as well?
Oh, right. So like for scholars within, biblical studies, if they use that kind of software.
Or would that be something you would use in your studies, or would they also try to integrate some of that into their stuff, just trying to see if they can have actual computer actually detect these sources?
Right. So yeah, since those are two different things, I'll talk about them separately.
Okay.
So for me, yes. I was actually invited as an undergrad to write a post for the Maxwell Institute for their website. So this was back in 2014 or 15 about Word Cruncher. It's really fantastic software that they created over the last couple of decades that helps you to do a lot of things with studying the text of the Book of Mormon. And you can actually run phrase comparison reports. So I used those a lot in my undergraduate thesis. And my undergraduate thesis is related to your second question, but not exactly there. I wanted to explore the question of the influence of Genesis 2 through 4 on the writing of the Book of Mormon. And in the past, there were basically just two publications that were related to that. There was one by John Sorensen in Dialogue in the 1970s. He had argued that it was likely the E source that Nephi and Lehi and the others would have had on the brass plates. And he didn't look really at the textual evidence very much. It was more of a sort of theoretical, if they were, potentially from the north, and scholars argue that the E source was from the north and those kinds of things, then, it might have been the E source. There's more to it than that. That's a very simplified version. But then the second one was in the early 90s, and that was Noel Reynolds. And he looked at Joseph Smith's revision of Genesis in what became the Book of Moses, so Genesis 1 through 6, and I guess basically the Eden narrative in the Book of Mormon, and tried to argue that they were both dependent on sort of an Ur text of Genesis. So the version that's in both of those is earlier than the current text of Genesis, something like that. And I responded to that ongoing conversation in my master's thesis, which built on my undergraduate thesis, because in my undergraduate thesis, I essentially said, the way that Genesis 2 through 4 is used in the Book of Mormon indicates that the author of the Book of Mormon, or at least the author of the individual specific chunks of text that I was studying throughout the Book of Mormon, was not aware of a non-English version of Genesis 2 through 4. And at the same time, the actual composition of those sections, the argument and the ideas in those sections about, Adam and Eve, like with Lehi and 2 Nephi 2, or about, quote unquote, the fall. And I could explain that too, why I say quote unquote the fall. In Alma 42, the author was blending J with P, was blending the New Testament in with both of those, was blending in all of these texts all over from the King James Bible, and blending everything in. And it wasn't just language; it's actually at the level of the composition of the book. Those chapters wouldn't make sense, 2 Nephi 2 or Alma 42, if you stripped out the material that shouldn't be there. New Testament, those kinds of texts and influences and concepts. And so that was my undergraduate thesis. My master's thesis, I looked more closely at the question of how the text of the Book of Mormon interpreted the Eden narrative in the same way as Smith's Bible revision. The Book of Mormon, of course, comes before his Bible revision, but it's the first thing that he does after the publication of the Book of Mormon. That's published in March 1830. And then in June, he begins revising he begins dictating Moses 1. And then by the end of that year and the beginning of the next, he's already gone through and revised Genesis 1 through 6. And it's the same narrative of Eden that all throughout the text of the Book of Mormon, the characters have been alluding to. So not only about Adam and Eve, but also the after Eden story with Cain and Abel, and the idea that Cain had made a pact with Satan, and that was what really brings the downfall of civilizations, and that's what destroyed both the Jaredites in Ether and eventually the Nephites themselves. Those secret oaths and secret combinations, which was a buzzword at the time, politically speaking.
Master Mahon.
Yeah, exactly that. And I spend a little bit of time in my master's thesis describing anti-Jacobinism at the time, and how that sort of bled into and worked with pushes against the Illuminati and anti-Masonry and all of those, and how all of those kind of combined in that context with the composition of the Book of Mormon. So in my master's thesis, I essentially pointed out how after Joseph Smith dictated the text of the Book of Mormon, and really a core part of the text is this idea that in Genesis there's a story about Cain making a pact, with Satan. He edited that exact story into the first several chapters of Genesis. So it would have, if he had the chance to publish it in his lifetime, if he had decided to eventually, it would have supplied the version of Eden and its aftermath with Cain and Abel for the Book of Mormon. So a reader of the Book of Mormon could have read right next to that Joseph Smith's revised Bible and would have had the same story, at the beginning of Genesis that was being alluded to all throughout the Book of Mormon. So there's a lot there, and I'm not sure if I rambled and went off of the topic too much there, but that was kind of my thing. And then in biblical studies, yes, there are a handful of different really expensive pieces of software that you can buy that help you to do word study, word analysis, and those kinds of things. It became really kind of in vogue in the late 70s and throughout the 80s, and every once in a while it still pops up to do, to try to figure out, authorship and word analysis. We can go through and have the computer sort of spit that out, but there are lots of really big problems with doing those kinds of things. And for me, I try to incorporate, technology as much as I can when it's really helpful, but I still do, my own work where I go through and do analysis as well to try to catch larger pieces of narrative or influence. And, it kind of just depends on the scholar, how they integrate those kinds of things. But to the extent that they're going to really use something to make a larger argument about, this word analysis supports the overall argument that, J does, continuously run through. I don't know if they, just as an example, but continuously run through from Genesis to, the end of Deuteronomy. Yeah, I haven't really seen those kinds of things. But Isaiah scholarship, I've seen that a few times in the past, and it usually doesn't work very well in my experience.
So is the consensus that there was at least 6 authors of the book of Isaiah?
Well, I don't know if there can be necessarily a consensus. It's really difficult because I think there were so many hands that went into composing Isaiah. Usually the very simplified version is that there are 3, right? So chapters 1 through 39 is Isaiah of Jerusalem. 40 through 55 is Deutero-Isaiah. 56 through 66 is Trito-Isaiah. Usually if you jump into the weeds a little bit with that, there are a couple of different authors, and Trito-Isaiah, I usually like to say third Isaiah. And then like a final editor. Deutero-Isaiah is pretty clean cut. It's the easiest of all of the 3 sections, at least. There are still arguments and debates, but usually you can just say it's 40 through 48 is one section, 49 through 55 is another. 55 is more difficult. About 100 years ago, scholars thought that 55 was part of third Isaiah, so there's some complication there. But it's really when you get into first Isaiah that's the most complicated. It's really difficult, and some fantastic scholarship over the last couple of decades, 3 or 4 decades, have really developed in some really productive ways, I think. Some of the work of H.G.M. Williamson and his students at Oxford University have been really beneficial to my research. Essentially, a more broad approach to understanding first Isaiah is that whoever compiled the entire book together wrote the first chapter. The first chapter was written in mind of being an introduction to the whole book. So then you have a whole bunch of chunks of text within that that would be way too complicated to get into in a podcast. But essentially, 13 through 14 would have been after, much later than Isaiah of Jerusalem. Parts of 6 through 12 would have as well. But then 24 through 27 that used to be called the Little Apocalypse, the Isaiah Apocalypse. That has shifted over the last couple of decades. I think people still refer to it that way, but it's not really an apocalyptic text. So yeah, you have that one, 24 through 27. And then you also have 33 through 35, which was probably written about the same time as Deutero-Isaiah. And then 36 through 39 was actually originally written in 2 Kings. And then whoever compiled the book of Isaiah basically lifted material from Kings and put it in there and sort of edited some of the material there. Different ways of understanding that too. But yeah, so it's a really, really complicated text. Some people argue that 33 through 35 was written by Deutero-Isaiah. Was it? Not sure. So, if it is, then that's the same hand. If it's not, then you have another author, right? Did the same author write each of those 3 chapters? Not sure, So yeah, it just kind of depends. It's more of most scholars look at it and say, okay, we at least agree that these are later, that these are early, kind of shifting it that way. It's more kind of a relative than a specific direct, like, okay, how many authors were in here? Because it's just complicated.
So I think it's good now about how this relates to the Book of Mormon, because the text of Isaiah that's in the Book of Mormon, it kind of poses some questions about which sections of Isaiah were in there, and then how we can then compare it to modern scholarship. B.H. Roberts basically made the argument that the Book of Mormon vindicates Isaiah as being one author because that's what it says. And that was kind of an early apologetic in favor of the Book of Mormon. Kind of discuss about the Isaiah problem, if you will, and the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect place to start. B.H. Roberts is really kind of the first one that engages it directly and tries to offer a full explanation. But yeah, by the time you get to the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, there were enough people paying attention to biblical studies and the Book of Mormon that they said, having the Book of Mormon quote from chapters 48 through 54, 55 is actually a problem. Those were written after the Babylonian exile. So, a group of Hebrews living in Jerusalem couldn't have had access to that if they had, scriptures on brass plates that they would take with them to the, to the Western Hemisphere. So, yeah, that became a problem really fast. And B.H. Roberts published a few things on the topic. And then in the 1920s, you had a graduate student at the University of Chicago named Sidney Sperry. He wrote a small master's thesis. Essentially, he had a short intro that was mostly quotations from the history of the church, the 7-volume history, with some commentary. And then basically the quotations of Isaiah with some notes on Hebrew, and then he had a conclusion. And so that was really that was the first fully academic attempt to sort of start the conversation. And he was responding to some other scholars that had pointed out that Isaiah was a problem for the Book of Mormon. And he finished his degrees there and then taught at BYU. And then in the late 1930s, he had a student, H. Grant Vest, that wrote a really good master's thesis on, and sorry, I'm just gonna take a drink really quick.
No problem, take your time.
On the problem of Isaiah. That was the name of the master's thesis. And yeah, it is an issue, and most people who have commented on it, for the last 100 years, we're in the 20s now, and B.H. Roberts was commenting on it before that. For the last 100 years, it's usually just been this simplified version that we were talking about a minute ago. So you have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah. Only 2nd and 3rd are a problem, right? So we'll just focus on those. There's no 3rd Isaiah in there, so we're good. And with 2nd Isaiah, well, we can just sort of argue that there was a core to 48 through 54 or so, and that was actually written by Isaiah, and that biblical scholars have gotten that wrong. And there are lots of issues with that approach, primarily because it ignores biblical scholarship. Not that it's just sort of like, well, they've got it wrong, Revelation's better. That's not it. The problem is that they're not even paying attention to the full breadth of biblical scholarship. So first Isaiah itself isn't in any kind of shape that it would have been in when Isaiah of Jerusalem either said or wrote the material there. Usually the first person narratives writing in Isaiah, most in those first few chapters, if it is in first person, a lot of most scholars are like, yeah, that was probably Isaiah, particularly because so much of it is written in the 3rd person about Isaiah. So it's usually those kinds of connections, not all the time, that scholars will then be like, okay, some of this is later. But it wasn't even in the same order. There's a huge, chapters 5 through 11 were reorganized, reordered. 10 and 11 were most likely authored by at least a later author around the time of Deutero-Isaiah, but also had some of the same perspective and worldview as the author of Isaiah. And that's coming from H.G.M. Williamson's book, the book called Isaiah, from the early 1990s. He explores that whole process, the influence of Deutero-Isaiah on the composition of first Isaiah. So yeah, there are more issues in it than have been discussed up to this point. And it's actually as much of a problem for the Book of Mormon to quote in block form directly all of the wording, all of the text from Isaiah 2 through 12. To have all of that, through 14. All of that wouldn't have been in that shape. A lot of it was actually written after the exile. And it's just kind of been unfortunate that, up to this point in Mormon studies, and it's understandable to a certain extent, that, that part and that aspect of biblical scholarship on Isaiah has been ignored. And there are actually lots of phrases throughout the Book of Mormon, not a ton, but a good handful that come from Third Isaiah. Some of them are sort of mediated through the New Testament. Paul liked Third Isaiah, so some of his quotations actually of Third Isaiah actually end up in the Book of Mormon in different parts. So, but yeah, I have a paper that's in the process right now with a journal of going through review and some revisions on this specific topic. So if that gets accepted, and goes ahead, then it should be in print, within the next year or so.
So when we were talking the other day, you had showed me some manuscripts that you're working on, where you're basically showing how the King James Version and the Book of Mormon parallel, and you had shown me how in some places there were a fair amount of changes, and other places there were just minor changes, where it's almost word for word what's in the King James that's also in the Book of Mormon. Just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. This was something that I started working on in David Bokovoy's the Book of Mormon as literature class. It was an undergrad course at the University of Utah in 2013. And I created a critical text, and I've sort of recreated it multiple times over the years. And the one that I showed you is the most recent one. But basically, I go through and use the 1830 text of the Book of Mormon, and I use the specific edition that they have on the Joseph Smith Papers website. And once I had that, then I started comparing that text to the original manuscript and to the printer's manuscript, and putting the notes. I created a text critical apparatus that has all the notes for all the different the variants, the differences in wording and spelling between those three. I also added in differences with Skousen's earliest text of the Book of Mormon, his edition. And then once I had all of that sort of layered and on there, and I had my text, I compared that to the King James text. And what you saw, what I think is really helpful visually to be able to understand the relationship between the Book of Mormon and the King James, was that whenever it was the same letter, right? If a letter was different, it would go white. Or if it was the same, it was gray. So I highlight it in all gray. And so I initially noticed this during that course, that essentially when Joseph Smith would start a block quotation, he would make a lot of changes, and then he would slowly make a little less and a little less. And then usually by about the end of that block quotation, there weren't that many changes in spelling or wording or whatever. And in the larger block quotation with Isaiah 2 through 14 and 2nd Nephi, there is a section that I showed you where on the critical text on the one that I created, you only have you have a full page and a half where you basically only have 2 letters that are changed. You have an S that's added with forests, and then Ramah becomes Ramat. There's a T that's added. And what that indicates to historians like me and Bill Davis and other scholars that are looking at the literary nature of the text and how it engages with the King James Bible, is that you have a 19th century editor. That this isn't restoring the text, and that's okay. Like, it's not a pejorative against Joseph Smith. It's just that that data is indicating that he is editing the text as he goes, and you can actually extract those edits. And that at certain points, for whatever reason, he if it was to save time, if he was tired, I don't know, I'm not sure. But what the data shows is that at certain points he decided to just dictate the text, to not make any changes. And that would not be expected if this was sort of an earlier version of the text or something like that. But also other details indicate that it isn't, someone with the King James Bible that's revising the text as well. I'm trying to think now, but I think it's Isaiah 49, so in First Nephi. At the beginning of the block quotation of Isaiah 49, you actually have material that's added that comes from Jeremiah 23. And toward the middle of that chapter, you have material that's added from Deutero-Zechariah, right? So I think it's in Zechariah 14, if I remember correctly. And that also indicates that you have someone who is thinking specifically, about Isaiah within its biblical context. Joseph Smith is putting the text of Isaiah in conversation with the other prophets in the Old Testament. So he's adding in material that's similar, that he finds similar from Jeremiah 23 and Zechariah 14, and putting that directly in as commentary on the book of Isaiah. So, and he's paraphrasing it too. It's not like he's doing a block quotation of those. It's just strings of words that are very specific to Jeremiah 23 and to Zechariah 14 that aren't found anywhere else in the Bible. So yeah, it's really fascinating once you actually do that kind of a study, when you really get into the granular details and are looking at all of those kinds of influences. You start to see a really cool picture of how Joseph Smith, an early American religious leader, was engaging with the text of the Bible. So it's
to our more faithful Latter-day Saints out there, you might be listening to this and thinking, well, this contradicts my the story that I've been told, or that I believe that the process was done supernaturally. Now, I acknowledge that, and all that I'm trying to say is I just want you as an audience to be educated in what the scholarship is telling us. And I would say the same on my side, if you will, with the Bible. We need to be aware of what the scholars are saying about my scriptures as well. And then it just gives you another data point that you can work with as you maneuver in this world and try to figure things out, right? Sometimes you just need to have as much information as possible, and you can decide where you want to go in that regard. But I think it's good for us to have knowledge of the scholarship. I want to talk a little bit about also Adam Clarke's commentary and that influence on the Book of Mormon. That's a relatively new development in scholarship, and maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So in regards to Joseph Smith being influenced by Adam Clarke, up to this point, Tom Wayment has done some really good work in that area. A handful of other scholars sort of did some preliminary work pointing in that direction, but Tom Wayment and Haley Wilson Lemon just last year had an essay published in University of Utah Press. Mike McKay and others, Mark Ashurst McGee and Brian Hauglid, all edited Producing Ancient Scripture. It's a really good collection of essays. It's a long book. I think it's over 500 pages. Highly recommend that to everyone that's watching, your audience. Anyone who's interested in Mormon studies, I highly recommend that book. But they have an essay in there where they look more specifically at Joseph Smith's revision of the Bible, particularly the New Testament. And they argue that they discovered somewhere around 300 or so instances where they can tie back the changes that Joseph Smith made to the New Testament back to Clarke's commentary. And more specifically on the Book of Mormon, I have an essay that I've been working on where I look at the quotations of Isaiah, particularly in the Book of Mormon. And I had essentially, because I had created that critical text of just the block quotations and spent so much time engaging with that material and that data, that I wanted to be able to explain the variations, all basically on my end, all of the little white spaces And some of those can be explained stylistically. There are some things that could be called Smithisms in the text, like he enjoyed, adding in certain chapters, "O Isles of the Sea," just little phrases like that. When there were certain words in italics, sometimes he would change that to "yea," and that was pretty consistent. Little things like that. But there were others that I couldn't explain with recourse to sort of stylistic difference, or just wanting to change the wording or italics or something like that. Just others that were substantial, that didn't have anything to do with the wording, or that didn't seem really necessarily clumsy. And so I started a notebook, started writing in just a list of these different changes, and I was reading through a handful of different commentaries that were widely available in the early 19th century. I knew about Toms and Haley's work, and on Adam Clarke, and so I was looking at commentary by Thomas Scott, by Matthew Henry, and Adam Clarke, different commentaries, and I decided to just start with Adam Clarke. And I knew the stories about Emma's uncle, and how he talked about, only 10 years after the publication of the Book of Mormon, how he talked about asking Joseph Smith some questions about the Book of Mormon, because Joseph Smith was trying to convert him to Mormonism, since he was a minister himself in Methodism. And he essentially, shared this story that, one time when he was saying that, telling me about how he was dictating the book, I asked, Joseph Smith, if the spectacles that were translating the text for him would work for anybody. Does it only work for you, or could somebody else put them on and see the translation as well? And Joseph Smith, according to the story, said, yeah, no, they would work for anybody. It doesn't just work for me. And so I think his name was Nathaniel Lewis. Lewis says, okay, great. Well, I actually have Clarke's commentary right here, and I could just pull it down, and in the notes, there's all of these different scripts. And so if I could just throw those on and I could look at the script and see what it would translate to, then I'll believe. Like that's a really easy test for me to know that what you're saying is true. And according to him, Joseph Smith was not too happy and stopped trying to convert him after that. So just from that story, only 10 or so years after the dictation of the Book of Mormon, and the way that he described it, the context was during the dictation of the Book of Mormon, would have been the first part in harmony. But he had access to Clarke's commentary. And Clarke's commentary was far more accessible than a lot of people are aware. It wasn't just that you had to buy all 4 or 5 volumes all at once and spend all of that money. You could actually buy individual signatures of different parts. And then if you were able to get the whole first comment, like the first volume of the commentary, you could take it to a binder and have it bound. So Clarke's commentary was everywhere, and he was the premier Methodist Bible commentator at the time. So jumped into that one, started making comparisons, and I was really surprised. At the time, I was working as an admin assistant in pediatrics at the University of Utah. I was kind of in between my grad programs, and I was taking a intro to theory course in the English department at the University of Utah. I was too busy, but I had had this whole list of potential things that I had found. I sat that down for about 6 months because I was just too busy that semester with work and school. And then literally weeks before we went into the pandemic, I went back over my notes, found my notebook, jumped back into it, and I went through the entire thing exhaustively and presented it to a handful of different friends individually, like a week before the pandemic. Like we could still get together for lunch. And then went into pandemic. And so so I have that paper that I've written and compiled, and hopefully we'll be able to have that out within the next year or so as well. But yeah, in that one I argue that that Clarke's commentary was involved in the dictation process of the Isaiah chapters in the Book of Mormon.
Oh, well, yeah, it's very interesting to have you discuss this work of yours, because I think my audience will find it fascinating. One of the things that we were talking about was at this period of time, the Book of Enoch kind of loomed large in Christianity, and because there was a recent translation that was done that kind of sparked kind of a debate and controversy as to whether the Book of Enoch that was translated was something that came was pre-Christian, or was something just to try to maybe was written to kind of make the quotes that are in the Book of Jude fit. And so there was this kind of debate in the world about this whole thing. Just talk a little bit about that, and where kind of Joseph might have fallen in that area.
Yeah. Thank you. I think it's a super interesting topic. So yeah, that issue kind of gained popularity back in the 1970s within Mormonism, because the Ensign, sort of the official, magazine of the LDS Church, published a series of essays that were written by Hugh Nibley, LDS scholar, and he went through and essentially argued that Joseph Smith couldn't have known anything about the Book of Enoch. It was too recent of a translation in 1830, since it was published in London in 1821. It was a new translation by Richard Lawrence. And so, that's gotten a lot of attention over the years, and some really, really good work has been done on it. Mike Quinn's second edition of his Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, I think he added something like 60 pages to that chapter in the second edition. And he had this whole section that expanded on, that question, where did Joseph Smith kind of fit in sort of the craze for Enoch, or even was there even a craze at the time? Because Hugh Nibley said that there wasn't. That was kind of the key. He said that no one cared about it. It went totally ignored, and no one, until the 1840s, in 1840s, sort of the first documented, Parley Pratt had it, and he wrote some articles in the Millennial Star on it. So that question has been kind of loomed large, I guess, for those who jump into these specific kinds of questions. And it's been really interesting to sort of observe the conversation from 1998 with Mike Quinn's second edition up until around today, because he essentially, from what it looked like, had found a potential reprinting of the Book of Enoch in 1828, and he had found that in National Union catalog of pre-1956 reprints. It was this very specific, basically it was almost 1,000 volumes, I think. It was created by the Library of Congress in the mid 20th century. It was basically a huge encyclopedia of all of the different books in all of the different libraries in the US. So it was sort of like, if WorldCat, if your viewers are familiar with WorldCat, but in print form, before the internet. And it says it in there. If you look at that specific volume, it says that there's an 1828. And so Mike Quinn, pointed at that and said, well, look, the Book of Enoch was more popular. It got another printing in 1828. And then a graduate student, Salvatore Cirillo, in 2010, I think, I actually can't remember where exactly he was, Durham maybe, but I think he was in the UK, and he wrote on this specific question for his master's degree. And he misquoted Quinn and said that it was published in 1828 in America. So if you're only using his thesis, then you think, oh, there was a printing of the Book of Enoch in 1828 in America. Oh, wow, that's perfect timing for Joseph Smith to be working on it in 1830, 1831. Because I don't think I've really said this quite yet, sorry. In Joseph Smith's revision of Genesis 1 through 6, he added an entire new chapter in between Genesis 5 and 6, which is Moses 7. And Enoch basically becomes sort of a proto-Christian prophet, or apostle, one of the apostles in Acts. He goes around, he travels to different areas and preaches, and it's this big narrative. He sees this panoramic vision of the world and its history, and just sort of the whole plan of salvation, right? And so you get this whole edition about the figure of Enoch, and in Joseph Smith's revision of Genesis. And the whole complication here is whether or not he had, like, the crux of the conversation has been whether or not he had Lawrence's 1821 translation. And that was basically set that way by Hugh Nibley. And I sort of entered that conversation last year with a publication to essentially say, why are we focusing on that question? If you actually look at the literature at the time, Lawrence wasn't the only one that was providing at least some translations of the Book of Enoch, the relevant portions of the Book of Enoch. The first translation of it was actually in 1715 into English, of chapters 1 through 32 of Enoch. And after that, there were subsequent translations. And if you look at all of the literature, there was an explosion of publications just after 1800, and then especially in the 1820s. There were lots of different newspapers and books and other things that were commenting on the Book of Enoch. So when I look at what, at least what Joseph Smith produced, right, the texts that Joseph Smith produced, you have that additional chapter, what's called the extract of the prophecy of Enoch, Moses 7 in the Book of Moses. You have an allusion in, I think, section 107 of the Utah-based LDS Church's Doctrine and Covenants, where it describes Adam having this conversation. He's speaking to his entire family, all of his posterity in Adam on Diamond. There's just this little note that says, all of this was written in the Book of Enoch, and it will come forth in due time. And it's kind of like, what? Give us more about that, So it's just these fascinating little tidbits, right? And to my eye, when I look at everything that I could find, because in my paper in Dialogue last fall, I was trying to look broadly at the availability of Enoch. I tried to find every book, every newspaper article, everything that even mentioned Enoch in it, not just the book, but just Enoch, and looked at all of that material. And when you compare that with what Joseph Smith was working on, I think it's a problem to focus so much on Lawrence, because really, even if you look at Hugh Nibley's comparisons between the Book of Enoch and the book and Smith's edition of the extract of the prophecy of Enoch, there really aren't that many comparisons. Nibley focused more on other Jewish pseudepigrapha, other ancient texts that aren't the Book of Enoch in his comparisons. There's very few connections that he actually makes to the Book of Enoch. So for me, it's pretty clear that Joseph Smith knew about the Book of Enoch, that it would come forth in due time, that it was coming. It was in America. There were some public debates about the Book of Enoch in the 1820s that included references to it that I found and discussed in my paper. But yeah, as far as Joseph Smith goes, I don't think that he had, actually had a copy of Lawrence's translation, but that he was very aware that there was a translation, that he was very aware of some of the conversations going on about the book, and that influenced the way that he was incorporating his ideas on Enoch into his dictations.
So it was interesting because you actually tried to track down this 1828 edition, and what did you find?
Yeah, thank you. I unfortunately, it doesn't exist. It was not only not printed in America, it wasn't printed at all. I think after engaging with the very helpful archivists at the rare, I guess it's like the Rare Books Department, I think was what it was called, in the New York Public Library. That was where the that huge book, the whole series said it was at. Contacted them, looked through a handful of their 20th century catalogs of their holdings of the Book of Enoch and those kinds of things. And I couldn't find it anywhere. And they said, no, we don't have any record of ever having this. And so I noticed that what they did have prior to the creation of that National Union catalog was two editions, one English and one Ethiopic, of an 1838 printing. And then when I looked back at the National Union catalog, they only had one of those, and then they had an 1828. And so to my eye, it looked like it was just a printing error. The person at the New York Public Library would have been, they had these note cards that were all set up for, for people to just write on the note card, send all the note cards into the, into the project, and they'll get added and then published. And I think that whoever wrote 1938 did it, the loop a little too low, and it might have looked like a 2. So 1828 instead of 1838, but it definitely was never published though. It was not printed. That did not happen.
Well, and you actually had the opportunity to let D. Michael Quinn know about this before he passed.
Right. Yeah. He came and spoke at Utah State University, and I was assigned to kind of hang out with him for the day, make sure he went to the different appointments that he had. And we had spoken a couple of times before that, but never in depth in that way. Spending an entire day with Mike was incredible. And yeah, I was in the process of doing some of the preliminary work for that paper. And I got to explain the whole story to him, and how his little note pointed me in that direction. And his reaction was hilarious. I told him, like, yeah, it doesn't exist. It's, the source that you were using, unfortunately, like, it was probably a printing error. And he laughed. He kind of said, oh no, he's like, well, I love that you went down that road, right? He's like, a lot of people don't like my lengthy notes and all of that kind of stuff, but I do that because I want to sort of start the road for other scholars. I want to just point them in those directions, and then for people like you, once you actually really fully go down that, then you find what is there or what's not there. So he was just a gentleman about it. Mike was incredible.
I just, in his passing, I just maybe you just comment briefly, what kind of person was D. Michael Quinn?
Mike was one of the most generous scholars I've ever met. I was blown away. I was kind of scared to tell him, and he was just exactly that kind of person. That you could actually engage with him and say, that was, unfortunately, that was wrong, and that little tiny piece of that one page in your really important book, is just slightly, we'll have to add another footnote in the future to that. But he was just kind, in every interaction I ever had with him. And just an incredible scholar too. I can get into the weeds, right? I can go down all of those, but I'm not. And this is funny because I think some people would respond differently to this. To a lot of scholars, he seemed like he went down all of those roads and was just always way too much in the weeds and left way too long of endnotes. And some of his endnotes were a page and a half long, and I think a couple longer. But he still had the kind of self-control to know, this is, I've gone down this a little ways, but this is where I need to stop, and I need to leave that for other people. And I really respect that, because he did that with so many topics. I can't even imagine being able to do the kind of work that he did. Like I'm very much more like Book of Mormon, Book of Moses, some of the dictated revelations and the Doctrine and Covenants, those kinds of things. Like I get really, really into those and then just stick with it and find lots of things. But yeah, he was just an incredible scholar and an incredible person.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I just want to kind of close on a little story, that another thing that you have made it interesting speculation to me, and that is that you've come to the conclusion that in the story that was told in 1838, that Professor Anthon had written an authentication of the translation being correct of the Anthon transcript. And then, of course, when he was told it was an angel that provided this these plates, he tore it up. Explain to me why you think that story is a later addition to the narrative.
Yeah, I for a long time had wished that I could have some sort of resource that would put all of the different, earliest accounts of like the production of the Book of Mormon into sort of a chronological order. And I was so happy a few years ago when Larry Morris's book came out, A Documentary History of the Book of Mormon. It's published by Oxford University Press. And he does exactly that. Like it's even better than I could have hoped for. So it was a couple of years ago. I was reading through the chapter on Martin Harris's visit to New York City with the characters document. And Morris actually points out in the introduction in the chapter, I think it's kind of toward the end, that at the end of the introduction, that the 1839 to 41 history that Joseph Smith wrote, which became the official, the history of the church volumes, that was the first time that anyone had mentioned that Martin Harris actually had a translation of the characters, not just the characters. And I think that little tiny nugget just sort of stuck with me, and I was like, oh, that's really, really fascinating. So none of the earlier accounts have that. And then I was working on some things on the Book of Abraham, doing a review of the Joseph Smith Papers volume, and a little bit before that I was doing some other things that were all kind of related. And yeah, it seems to me that Joseph Smith realized the utility in sort of the his narrative building and the building of his narratives and story telling of the story of the production of the Book of Mormon. That in 1838-39, when he's working on the history of the church, at that point, Martin Harris was no longer there. He'd been excommunicated. Oliver Cowdery had been excommunicated. A handful of those earlier significant founders of Mormonism weren't there, and he was in many ways sort of retelling that earlier story. Usually that history is looked at as sort of the authoritative earlier history, but the more that I engage with it, the more I'm of the mind that it's a retelling, that it's not just an issue with memory or something else, but that he's coming out of a really contested period in 1837 with some of his closest friends and confidants, and he wants to be able to have control of the narrative, and he wants to be able to tell his story the way he sees fit in any given moment. And so you have this extra detail in that history that Martin Harris gave not just the characters for Charles Anthon to look over and say, yes, this is some sort of Reformed Egyptian or not, but that he gave him a translation to go with it, and that Anthon authenticated the translation, and that's what that paper would have said. If we jump back to Joseph Smith's purchasing of not only the mummies but the papyri as well, with Michael Chandler in 1835 in Kirtland, you have that exact same scenario. It's almost the same story in some ways. Joseph Smith and I think Oliver Cowdery both go grab some of some other documents and things that he and characters document in particular, actually. So you already have a very clear connection between the two stories. But Joseph Smith comes back and he starts to actually indicate, oh, okay, well, these scrolls, from Abraham and Joseph, and it starts telling them a bit about that and doing some translation work kind of on the spot. And Michael Chandler signs a note saying Joseph Smith basically knows how to translate Egyptian, and I've shown these around to all of the best luminaries all over the different cities, and I'm sort of affirming that Joseph Smith knows how to translate. And so he gets this little document and signed by Michael Chandler, and in the process of showing the mummies and the papyri, Joseph Smith was able to also show the little certificate, indicating that the translation that he had done was correct, according to Michael Chandler. Michael Chandler didn't know Egyptian. He couldn't have indicated that, nor could have Charles Anthon done that. He wouldn't, not only, couldn't have, said, yes, this is an accurate translation of Egyptian, but he probably wouldn't have known enough about Egyptian to say, yes, this is Reformed Egyptian either. Plus, Anthon himself said, no, there were Greek and Hebrew characters. There were some Roman ones that were sort of tilted or something like that, with a larger circle around them with different compartments. And yeah, to me, since we have that first, that little detail that Martin Harris is claiming that Charles Anthon had, signed off on the translation being accurate, only showing up after 1835 in a retelling of the earlier history. To my eye, that looks like the 1835 experience is influencing Joseph Smith's rewriting of the story, and that in that new context, Joseph Smith realizes and understands the utility of that experience that he learned in 1835 with Chandler. He probably got excited at some of the people's faces as he showed the mummies and showed the little certificate, and that has helped in telling that story in the official church ever since that this eminent scholar indicated that Joseph Smith had translated the Reformed Egyptian on the plates accurately. So yeah, that's kind of my working theory. I haven't published on that yet. I haven't even really started the process of piecing together a paper on that, but yeah, we were just talking about that the other day, so it's kind of fun to share.
Yeah, it's very, very fascinating to hear the story. Now, again, folks, this is one of the top minds in Mormon scholarship who's sharing with you some of his thoughts and also some of the discoveries he's made, which I find truly fascinating. I also think it's really awesome that you were able to tell Michael Quinn your finding, and he so appreciated the fact that you were following the footnotes, because that was just so important to him to have all that. And so it's just been a really cool conversation to have with you today, Colby. We did get down in the weeds a little bit, which this channel's not afraid to do, and to have these kind of conversations, because partly I feel this channel is kind of breaking new ground with some of my interviews, things that have not been told before, stories that haven't been told before are being told on the channel. And I just wanted to share with the audience one of the finest minds in Mormon scholarship. And it's been truly a delight, Colby, to have you on my channel. I want to thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you too. I really appreciate it. You're kind, and I've really enjoyed watching the channel. All the different interviews have been great. So thank you for having me on.
I appreciate that, man. It always means a lot to me when my guests say, I love your channel. It's like, wow, they're actually watching my channel. So either way, I just want to remind my viewers to hit the like and subscribe button and leave your comments down below. I will be providing links to some of the discussion material that we've had today. I'll talk to Colby about what kind of links we can provide afterwards. And you just have a wonderful day, and all will be well. We are going to get through the apocalypse any day now. So have a great day.